Hello, this is Pastor Jeff, and unfortunately, tonight for our midweek Wednesday Lenten service, we had some technical difficulties. So it wasn't able to be broadcast out to you, but I thought I would give you the lesson here and use my sermon as a kind of devotion to share with you on this Wednesday here in Lent. First of all, to Malia, she came out and read for us tonight. Thank you so much, Malia. I'm so sorry we weren't able to get that broadcast like we planned to do. So from 2 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, St. Paul writes, "So if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ, and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting the message of reconciliation to us. So we are ambassadors for Christ. Since God is making his appeal through us, we entreat you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." Well, this year during Lent, we're using those street signs, or those traffic signs rather, as kind of the images that we're holding on to. And on Ash Wednesday, our first sign was road work ahead. We talked about the reality that there is much to do in our spiritual lives, and it's an ongoing process. Then we moved from there to the stop sign. The stop sign reminded us that God's love never stops. There's nothing that we can do that can prevent God's love from being poured out to us. And then we had the U-turn. And the U-turn was a reminder that there are things that get in the way of love of God and love of neighbor. Those are things that we need to turn away from, that we literally make a U-turn away from in order to return back to where we are to be with God. And then last week, we had the yield sign. And the yield sign, we used the Philippians passage that Paul tells us to have the same mind in us that was in Christ Jesus. And we talked about what was the mind of Christ, but it was the mind of a servant, the mind of showing us what it is to love neighbor, and that we're not to defy or resist that, but yield to that very same spirit that Christ showed us. Well, tonight, our road sign, and I wish I had the screen for you, but the road sign is Road Narrows. Road Narrows. So you've seen that sign. It's a line going like this, and then another line kind of comes in. So the road narrows. Well, combined with our reading from 2 Corinthians, I wanted to reflect on that a little bit tonight. And I start off with a story. When I was a teenager, my Boy Scout troop did a rim-to-rim hike in the Grand Canyon. Now, it was an amazing adventure that I still cherish today. The beauty of the Havasupai Falls, of the pools of water in the bottom of the Grand Canyon were just breathtaking. And to this day, they're still inspiring to me. Really unbelievable to see in person. But what I'll always remember is the final hike out. I think we somewhat kind of misrepresented how long it really would take for us to make the hike out. We underestimated how long it would be to kind of leave the bottom of the canyon and make our way to the top. And so as we were doing that with strenuous switchbacks and the like and ascending, we really were falling behind schedule. And by the time we reached the wall of the canyon to kind of begin that ascent, the sun was already on its way down. And it got darker and darker as the trail got more and more narrow as we're kind of making our way up from the bottom of the canyon. Well, of course, being Boy Scouts, we followed the Scout motto, be prepared. So we had our flashlights at the ready, and even though it was getting dark, and even though the road was narrow, or the trail was narrow, we were fine. But I can still remember being puzzled by a noise. it was kind of a low grumbling, growling at first, and then the vibrations kind of began. The vibrations underfoot. The sun had now totally disappeared, and we were about 3/4 the way up the canyon. You really couldn't see much ahead of you. We had the flashlights, but they really couldn't shine ahead. But the noise got louder and louder, and the vibrations more and more severe, until finally it was kind of a blur. But rushing down the trail, coming right at us, was a herd of donkeys. And now I imagine they were being released for the night to go down and graze, and they were coming right at us. I can remember leaning into the wall of the canyon, trying to protect myself with my hands, trying to push each animal kind of away from me as they careened down the trail. It was a narrow road we were on. And the reality was, whether we liked it or not, whether we realized it or not, it was a road that we shared. And sharing the road is not always easy. That's the image I have tonight as we approach this Wednesday in our reading from 2 Corinthians. Paul is talking about reconciliation, about forgiveness, about how it is we survive the road that can feel very narrow at times, especially when we feel hurt or threatened or wronged. A road that we have to share with other flawed human beings. And a road like that always seems painfully narrow. It seems that we're constantly running into each other. That's hard to navigate. I don't know if you remember, but Paul's relationship to the people at Corinth was challenging, to say the least. In 2 Corinthians, the 2nd chapter, Paul writes these words. He says, "For I wrote you out of much distress and anguish of heart, and with many tears." Now, this letter of tears, as it's referred to, we don't have it anymore. It's lost. But we know from Paul's own account, he wrote a letter which was a letter of rebuke. It was an angry letter of tears that he wrote to the people in Corinth. And we know that this happened in the ancient world, that oftentimes letters of protest, if you will, would be kind of penned and sent. And Paul obviously sent one of these letters, a letter that told of the pain that he felt the Corinthians had caused him. Well, we know later on in Corinthians that Paul also acknowledges that this letter that he sent also caused a lot of pain for the people of Corinth. It's a real mess. And of course, we only have Paul's perspective, but we know that there are many sides to every story, and everybody evidently felt wronged. And it gets even worse. In the midst of this bad situation, these troublemakers kind of move in, and they try to stir the pot even more. Paul despairingly calls them super apostles, making fun of how puffed up they are with their own importance. And so there's name calling, there's hurt feelings, there's accusations. This road that they're on in Corinth is about as narrow as it can get. So what's the answer to life lived in a narrow road? Where flawed people hurt each other's feelings, where people don't get along and don't see things eye to eye. Well, for Paul, the answer is forgiveness, reconciliation. Forgiveness is the only way to go on living with and in spite of the mess. I want to say that again. Forgiveness is the only way to go on living with and in spite of the mess that's been created. It's the only way simultaneously to take responsibility for wrongs committed and to live as if a new start is possible. This is the power of the new creation that Paul is talking about. A new creation doesn't pretend that the old didn't exist. It simply claims hold of the new reality that can supersede it. In other words, forgiveness is the exercise of hope that the old hurts can give way, that we can be defined not by that which caused offense, but by the new thing that God is doing in our midst. You see, Paul knows it's a mess. He knows that he's hurt feelings, and he knows that his feelings are hurt. And the only way to move forward, the only way to get through this narrow road where everybody is pressed in on each other, is to exercise forgiveness, reconciliation, the exercise of hope that the old hurts can give way to a new possibility. I think in some ways, Paul is making a little bit of a self-confession. He's reminding the Corinthians that this is the work of Christ. The work of the Christian is to be about forgiveness, about reconciliation. Just as Christ reconciled the world and all of us to God, this is to be the ministry that we're called to as well. In fact, Paul's going to say we're ambassadors of Christ. We are ever mindful of the need to forgive, to be forgiven, and to look for ways to reconcile with one another as we travel this narrow road we call life. You know, forgiveness really is the way to navigate. On that road, on that trail a long time ago, my impulse was to use my hand to kind of push out, to protect myself, because I was afraid. Paul reminds us that the way past our fear, the fear that we have when we're hurt, the fear that we have when we disappoint each other, is not to push each other away, but to invoke what Christ invoked. That is the power to forgive. So my thought for us tonight is it's a narrow road. It is a narrow road when flawed, imperfect people like myself and like all of us travel together. But we can travel together when we learn how to forgive one another. And that's the good news that's really proclaimed throughout the year, not just on this Wednesday in Lent. So thanks for joining me. Thanks for tuning into the video. God bless you. We'll be live again on Sunday morning, 8:30, 10:30. And while we are called upon to exercise physical distance, it's not social distancing. That's just wrong. We need to stay socially connected. So I invite you to reach out to each other, to share the peace, to pray for one another, to stay connected. I'll see you soon. God bless you.